15 minutes of terror. That's what aerospace engineers call the autonomous, unguided descent from lunar orbit down to the surface. In this explainer, we're doing a forensic autopsy on one of the most nail-biting and ultimately heartbreaking moments in modern space exploration, the Chandrayaan-2 lunar descent. For 48 days, ISRO flawlessly navigated their spacecraft through the cosmos. But landing on the moon? Yeah, that's a whole different beast. We're going to break down exactly what happened during those terrifying final minutes, look at the intricate technical dominoes that led to the crash of the Vikram Lander, and see how that very crash actually ended up reshaping the future of space exploration. Okay, picture the scene. It's September 6th, 2019. Inside ISRO's mission control in Bengaluru, the tension is just suffocating. The Prime Minister is there, millions of Indians are glued to a live broadcast, and the whole world is holding its breath as India tries to become only the fourth nation to ever pull off a soft landing on the moon. The lander, Vikram, named after the father of the Indian space program, Dr. Vikram Sarabhai, is meticulously slowing down. Velocity is dropping, altitude ticks lower and lower. 30 kilometers, down to 7.4 kilometers, and then just 2.1 kilometers above the lunar surface. Everyone is waiting for touchdown. And then, dead silence. The telemetry literally just freezes. The running commentary stops. The joyous smiles in the control room instantly vanish. It's just devastating silence. The communication link between Vikram and the ground station was completely severed.
Let's look at the timeline here to really appreciate the absolute gravity of that sudden silence. Because space missions aren't just one single moment, right? They're this massive, complex chain of events. And right up until that 2.1 kilometer mark, Chandrayaan-2 was a spectacular success. The launch back on July 22nd on the huge GSLV Mark III rocket, flawless. The orbit-raising maneuvers and the translunar injection, textbook. By September 2nd, the orbiter had cleanly separated from the lander. So you've got a spacecraft that has successfully traveled hundreds of thousands of kilometers, working perfectly for over a month. Honestly, the mission was like 90% successful before the descent even started. But that incredibly thin margin, that final 10% soft landing phase, that's where your room for error shrinks from millions of miles down to absolute zero.
So to really understand the crash, we have to walk through the planned tick-tock sequence of the descent. Vikram's job was literally to hit the brakes, slowing down from a blistering 6,000 kilometers per hour to exactly zero. And it had to do this in distinct phases. Step 1 was the rough braking phase. This lasted about 10 minutes, using maximum engine thrust just to bleed off that massive orbital speed. And this phase actually went perfectly. Altitude dropped exactly as planned. Then came Step 2, the camera coast phase. This was a really brief 38-second window. During this phase, the spacecraft had to hold a very specific 50-degree attitude, basically keeping perfectly still, so its onboard cameras could stare at the landing site and figure out exactly where it was. Finally, it was supposed to enter the fine braking phase for touchdown. But that transition into the quiet 38-second camera coast phase, that's exactly where our phantom errors started to creep in. And here is where the very first domino falls. To enter that camera coast phase, Vikram had to throttle down its 5 800-Newton liquid main engines. The expected deceleration thrust needed to hold its perfect trajectory was about 2.13 meters per second squared. But the actual thrust it produced was roughly 2.78 meters per second squared. That's about 13% higher than expected. Why did this happen? Well, actuating the engine valves at high speeds to throttle them down caused them to misbehave just a little bit. They didn't close exactly as expected. Now, I know it sounds completely microscopic, right? Just a fraction of a meter per second of extra thrust. But in orbital mechanics, small numbers compound insanely fast. Over those 38 rigid seconds where the spacecraft couldn't adjust its attitude because it was forced to stare at the landing site, that tiny bit of extra thrust pushed Vikram hundreds of meters upwards and totally away from its planned ideal trajectory. Which brings us to the software. Coming out of that camera coast phase, Vikram wakes up, checks its position, and realizes, uh-oh, I am way off course. It was higher up and moving way faster horizontally than it should have been. Now, a robust system might just recalculate a brand new path. But Vikram's software suffered from an inability to handle what ISRO chief S. Somanath later called parameter dispersion. Basically, the navigation system was strictly chasing a ghost. It was chasing this pre-programmed, mathematically perfect descent trajectory. It was built on a success-based design, meaning it just assumed every single previous step had executed perfectly. So, when faced with this massive discrepancy, the software simply didn't know how to gracefully compromise. Instead of just gently throttling down to fix the error, it essentially panicked. It tried to force the lander back onto the original, now completely impossible path by commanding extreme attitude corrections. And that panic perfectly illustrates the next devastating constraint. The software is screaming at the spacecraft, "We're too high and too far. Pitch forward and dive to lose altitude." To get back to its target, the lander starts pitching over, eventually trying to point itself completely upside down in a massive 410-degree rotation. But here's the fatal hardware flaw. The spacecraft was physically restricted to rotating at a maximum rate of only 10 degrees per second. 10 degrees! To put that in perspective, that is like trying to parallel park a bus while you're hurtling down a highway. It took a grueling, agonizing 36 seconds just to complete that corrective spin. And by the time the lander slowly lumbered through this huge maneuver and finally got itself righted back to a vertical position, time had simply run out.
As if that agonizingly slow rotation wasn't enough, we have the final domino, the size of the landing site itself. ISRO had targeted a tiny, highly specific 500-meter by 500-meter patch of lunar real estate near the South Pole. So why is this a problem? Well, as Vikram finally finishes its slow, desperate spin and looks at the ground, the software does the math and realizes that reaching that microscopic 500-meter box is now mathematically impossible from where it is. And this just completely scrambles the guidance system. It couldn't just say, "Hey, let's land in that flat area over there instead." It was locked onto a target it literally could no longer reach, which triggered a total breakdown in the descent logic. Just to show you how critical this constraint was, take a look at the huge difference in landing zones shown here. For the subsequent Chandrayaan-3 mission, ISRO expanded the zone to a massive 4.2 kilometers by 2.5 kilometers. They gave the software plenty of room to just improvise.
So here's the crucial point. We are now literally just seconds away from the end. The camera coast phase had ended, the extra thrust had pushed the vehicle totally off course, the rigid software demanded a radical correction to hit a tiny target, and the slow hardware took way too long to actually execute it. The Vikram lander was now completely off trajectory. In fact, Doppler radio plots tracked by amateur radio astronomers back on Earth showed these wild wiggles in the transmission frequency during those final 54 seconds. It really paints this frantic picture of a guidance system desperately fighting a losing battle against the laws of physics. The final telemetry received just seconds before impact tells a really terrifying story. Vikram was hurtling toward the jagged lunar surface at a descent rate of 50 to 60 meters per second. That is incredibly fast. To put that into perspective for you, the lander's legs were engineered to absorb a maximum shock impact of just 5 meters per second. It was supposed to be moving at a super gentle 2 meters per second for a soft touchdown. But now, it was falling at 10 times its absolute maximum structural limit. The engines were firing, trying to decelerate against this immense velocity, but they just weren't generating enough thrust in the right direction to counteract the freefall. Exactly 54 seconds after exiting that camera coast phase, it was over. Impact. The Vikram lander, along with the 26-kilogram six-wheeled Pragyan rover tucked safely inside its belly, slammed into the lunar surface about 500 meters away from the intended landing site. The sheer kinetic energy of a crash at that speed instantly destroyed the onboard systems, severing all communication. In that somber, super quiet room back on Earth, the dream of exploring the shadows of the lunar South Pole with a rover had, for that moment, come to a very sudden and tragic end. But, and this is a massive but, we absolutely cannot let those final 54 seconds define the entire narrative of this mission. The Chandrayaan-2 mission was explicitly designed as a whole system, not just a single moment of spectacle. While the lander was lost, the mothership, the Chandrayaan-2 orbiter, remained exactly where ISRO parked it, 100 kilometers above the moon. And honestly, it is a scientific powerhouse. It was equipped with 8 state-of-the-art instruments, including the highest resolution camera ever sent to the moon at the time. It's mapped the lunar surface in 3D, studied mineral abundance, and searched for water signatures. And because the launch was so incredibly precise, this orbiter, which was initially designed for just a 1-year life, is expected to operate and beam back invaluable data for nearly 7 years. I mean, that is the very definition of long-term space infrastructure. Furthermore, the forensic autopsy of Vikram's crash directly paved the way for future triumphs. ISRO didn't hide from this failure. They meticulously dissected it. They ran simulations with extreme variations just to see exactly what broke the software. As ISRO chief S. Somanath brilliantly put it, instead of a success-based design, ISRO has this time opted for a failure-based design. For their follow-up mission, they just assumed things would go wrong. They looked at sensor failures, engine failures, algorithm failures.
They increased the rotation rate from 10 degrees to 25 degrees per second. They gave the lander a much larger target area and the autonomy to just land wherever it safely could if things got hairy. They took a devastating crash and transformed it into a comprehensive masterclass in resilient engineering.
Which leaves us with this final, profound thought. Space exploration has always been a high-wire act without a net, right? But the evolution from Chandrayaan-2 to its successors shows this incredible maturation in how we approach the cosmos. We're no longer just hoping for perfect sequences, we're actively engineering for the inevitable chaos of reality. So, how will this crucial shift from success-based hope to failure-based resilience redefine the future of global space exploration? Next time you look up at the moon, remember those 15 minutes of terror, the silence that followed, and the incredible science that rose from the dust. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the universe.